Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Today we are continuing with our series on the Florence monster, Italy's most prolific and mysterious serial killer. This is part 2. So if you have not seen part 1 yet, I linked it in the description box and I suggest you watch that first because 1 always comes before 2. And you're going to need information from that first video to understand what's happening in this second video. And I'll also link this second part in the description box of part 1 so that if you go to part 1 and you can't find your way back, you will now. You'll have a roadmap on how to get back. So as a quick breakdown, between 1968 and 1985, the Florence monster targeted and attacked 8 couples in vehicles while they were in the throes of passion. Each and every time the killer used the same weapon, a .22 caliber Beretta pistol loaded with Winchester Series H bullets. A distinctive marking made by a defective firing pin in that weapon allowed investigators to eventually connect all 8 double murder cases. In part 1, we discussed the murders of Giovanni Foggi and Carmela D'Annunzio, as well as Pasquale Gentilicore and his girlfriend Stefania Pettini. We also talked about Stefano Baldi and his fiancée Susanna Cambi, and the final couple that we spoke about in part 1 was Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini. So by the time Paolo and Antonella's deaths were reported, all of Florence knew that there was a bloodthirsty killer on the loose, and obviously they were eager for the police to solve the crimes and put someone behind bars so they could all feel safe in their own towns again. Now, at this time, loads of tips were coming into the Florence police, and one letter caught the eye of investigators. It had been written anonymously, but it included a newspaper clipping from a 1968 double murder that had happened in Lastra a Signa, just west of Florence. So we're going to pick up there, and there's a lot more to talk about still. So grab a snack, grab your coffee, drink tea, decaf coffee if you need to, I guess. I understand. Find a comfortable seat, put your feet up, relax. We're going to dive in, but first, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Helix Sleep. This video is sponsored by Helix Sleep, and it's a great time, a perfect time, some might say, to upgrade your mattress because you can get 20% off your mattress in 2 free pillows for a limited time. And the pillows are bomb. Helix Sleep's pillows are a bomb. So check out the Helix site for more details. And if you're not familiar with what Helix Sleep is, Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses and bedding that are customized to fit your needs and conveniently shipped to your door. I've personally been sleeping on my Helix Sleep mattress for years now, like at least over 5 years. And I used to think that I was waking up sore and tired because that's what happens when you enter your 30s. But then I got my Helix Midnight Luxe mattress and I realized that this wasn't true at all because now I get some of the best sleep of my life. In fact, every single person in my house, big or small, has a Helix Sleep mattress. And you'll get started the same way that all of us did by taking the quick Helix Sleep quiz. Everyone is different and Helix knows that, so they made this sleep quiz, which is going to match your unique body type and sleep preference to the perfect mattress for you. Based on my sleep and firmness preference, I was matched with the Helix Sleep Midnight Luxe mattress. It is perfect for me because I only sleep on my side and I like a firmer mattress. So if you sleep with a partner, you can take the quiz together and Helix is going to match you with a mattress that gives both of you what you want and need. And now I wake up feeling more rested because I'm not tossing and turning all night trying to find that elusive, comfortable position. I just curl up onto my side and I'm out. I don't get a ton of sleep because I stay up late and I get up early, but the sleep I'm getting is good because I'm not waking up several times a night. I'm also not waking up feeling sore all over. So bonus, I guess I'm not as old as I thought I was. I also love that unlike other mattress companies that use fiberglass as a flame retardant in their mattresses, Helix Sleep, they own their own manufacturing facility that's entirely free from products containing fiberglass, and there have been a number of health concerns related to fiberglass being in mattresses, so I sleep even better now knowing that Helix does not use it in their mattresses. And the best part is, at least this is the best part for me because I like to stay home and I'm an introvert, you don't have to go to a mattress store store and awkwardly lay on a bunch of beds in public to find the one that's right for you. Helix is going to ship your mattress right to your door with free shipping within the U.S., and the mattress comes rolled up in a box. It's incredibly easy to open up, unroll, and set up yourself. And Helix is so sure that you'll love your new mattress, they're going to give you 100 nights to sleep on it in your own home. So if you're nervous about buying something sight unseen, if you're nervous about buying a mattress that you haven't actually tried out, you get more than 3 months to try it out to make sure that you love it. And if you don't, Helix is going to take it back, no questions asked. My whole family loves our Helix sleep mattresses, and if you've been thinking about replacing your mattress or upgrading your mattress, I have a great deal for you. Right now, Helix Sleep is offering you 20% off your mattress plus 2 free pillows. And this is a great deal, not just because the pillows are amazing, and they are, because my husband conveniently, whenever he makes the bed, he puts both of the Helix pillows on his side. And so I have to get 2 more just to avoid the fight we have every night where I'm like, that's my pillow. And he's like, what are you talking about? These are both my pillows. And it's a whole thing, but they are really good pillows. So all you have to do is click the link below or go to helixsleep.com/Harlowe to take advantage of this great deal. Once again, click the link in the description box or go to helixsleep.com/Harlowe to take advantage of this deal and get yourself a new mattress. And let me know when you take the Helix Sleep quiz which mattress model you paired with. Thank you so much to Helix Sleep for sponsoring today's video. And let's dive in. Before we dive into the story, I wanted to let everyone know that at the end of this video, not only are we going to talk about Stephanie's small business showcase, as always, but I've been getting tons and tons of questions and comments on YouTube and Instagram about my lip combo, I guess, that I wear, what kind of lipstick and things I use. And it's super simple and very easy to replicate. Like, I'm not a makeup person. I wear makeup, but I'm not like a makeup artist by any means, but it's super simple and easy to replicate if you want to. So I will quickly give you that combo at the end of the video as well, just before I forget, because I made a note in my notebook in the Florence Monster notes to let you guys know what that lip combo was. So stay tuned till the end of the video, and I will quickly go over that for you. So without further ado, let's talk about the Florence Monster, or the Monster of Florence. They are the same person, right? But that term will be interchangeably used throughout this video. Just so you know, I'm speaking about the same person. This anonymous, mysterious Italian serial killer who's still not identified. And it's driving me crazy. It's driving me crazy because he should be, okay? But let's talk about it. Lastra a Signa is a historic town along the Arno River, originally built as a military outpost to defend Florence. Located near Monte Spertoli, where Antonella and Paolo had been murdered in June of 1982, Lastra a Signa was home to many Sardinian immigrants in the 1960s, and amongst them were the Mele family, whose patriarch was Palmerio Mele. So Palmerio had 5 children altogether, a daughter named Maria and a son named Stefano from his first wife, who ended up passing away. Then he had 3 more children, which was Giovanni and Teresa. They were twins. And then Antonetta, another daughter. He had these children with his second wife, who also passed away. When the oldest son, Stefano, was born in 1919, the family lived in a very poor town on the island of Sardinia. And I mean, at that time, Sardinia wasn't the beautiful exotic tourist destination that it is right now. It was in general a poverty-stricken island, which is one of the main reasons that many, many people from Sardinia and Sicily left their islands and traveled to the mainland of Italy and settled there. But it was in Sardinia that Palmerio Mele decided to arrange a marriage between his then 40-year-old son and a 20-year-old woman named Barbara Locci. The Locci family approved of this union despite the very large age difference and despite the fact that everyone knew Stefano wasn't really all there. And I'm going to explain why he wasn't all there a little bit later, but he was very small, like very short, very slender, and just basically he seemed to be maybe a little developmentally disabled. Like, he wasn't that intelligent. He really had a hard time with logic and critical thinking, and it just seemed most of the time that he didn't really know what was going on, that he was more an observer of life than an active participant. But Barbara Locci's family approved of this marriage because the Mele family was slightly better off financially than the Locci family. So when Palmerio and his children, including Stefano, decided to leave Sardinia and settle on the Italian mainland, Barbara went with them, and they set up a home in Lastra outside of Florence. Barbara was a beautiful, free-spirited woman, and she was very outgoing, very extroverted, basically the polar opposite of her older husband, who was quiet, kept to himself, didn't really speak unless he was spoken to, and even then sometimes wouldn't say a word. And it was said that Barbara really enjoyed the attention of men. Not the attention of her husband, the attention of other men. And she enjoyed also wearing very tight-fitting clothing to show off her curves. Barbara really liked to be out and about. She liked to be at the bars. She liked to be, carousing, drinking, dancing in the streets, singing, just having a good time and being young and enjoying her life, which would usually not include her husband at all. So upon their arrival in the Florence area, Barbara began to make a spectacle of herself, negatively affecting the reputation of her husband's family. Now, it was known that she would steal money from her in-laws, and then she would sneak out at night to meet with other men who she would then spend her in-laws' money on. So she would bring them to the movies, she would bring them out to eat, she would pay for drinks at the bar, put gas in their cars, etc., etc. And so her father-in-law, Palmerio, he tried to put a stop to Barbara's well-known nocturnal activities. And so he put bars, metal bars, on all the downstairs windows in the house. But Barbara still found a way to continue her affairs in a very public manner. I mean, this woman was not above shimmying down a drain pipe to get to where she needed to go. Now, this led everyone in the town to both pity and lose respect for Stefano Mele as well as his family, because Stefano was clearly very aware of his wife's many affairs, but he seemed completely unbothered by them, and he did nothing to stop them. I'm not sure why it was anybody's business what was going on between Stefano and Barbara if he didn't seem upset about it, but people get bored, they like to talk. So in 1961, another Sardinian family arrived in Signa, and this family was the Vinci brothers, Giovanni, who was the oldest, Salvatore, who was the middle son, and Francesco, the youngest. It seemed that with each of the Vinci brothers, as they were born, they became more irresponsible, more kind of egotistical, more just sort of rebellious. So Giovanni, the oldest, he was kind of the quietest. He was known to wear spectacles, and he kind of kept to himself, even though he wasn't an angel either. And then Salvatore was slightly more like outgoing, more cocky, had more swagger. And then Francesco, the youngest, was, he thought he was a mafia boss, basically, walking around town, whether it was in Florence, whether it was in Lastra, whether it was in Villacidro, in Sardinia. He was just kind of the big man on campus. He loved women. He got into multiple, very passionate relationships, and everyone kind of knew what he was about. Like in the 1960s, they didn't use this term, but he kind of was, he was a fuckboy, kind of. That's what you would have called him. I mean, that's what we would call him today. Back then, they'd probably, just refer to him as a ladies' man or, an alley cat or a Lothario or something like that. But fuckboy energy all day. So when the brothers arrived on the Italian mainland, Salvatore, the middle brother, he quickly found work as a bricklayer, and he also began renting a room in the Mele house, where he and Barbara Locci quickly connected, and they started a years-long affair. Now, according to Salvatore Vinci, not only was Barbara's husband, Stefano, aware of what was going on between his wife and their boarder, but he actually encouraged it. So Salvatore and Stefano knew each other before Salvatore moved in with Stefano and his parents and his wife. And Salvatore said that Stefano was the one who had basically begged him to move in. He told Salvatore, listen, we got a free room for you. And Salvatore was like, well, I don't have a lot of money to pay you. And Stefano was like, just pay us when you can, which didn't make any sense because one thing that has remained a constant about Stefano Mele is he never had any money. He was always in dire financial straits. But apparently he really wanted Salvatore to move in to his house. And when Salvatore did move in, the first thing he claims Stefano did was introduce him to his wife, Barbara, who allegedly and reportedly At the time of this meeting, she was in bed in a state of undress. And then Salvatore claims that Stefano told him to take Barbara out, take her out in the town, take her to the movies, bring her out to eat. She likes to have fun, show her a good time. And a lot of the time, Stefano would also leave Salvatore and Barbara alone in the house, and he would go out and play cards with his friends at their homes or at the local bar. So Stefano kind of knew what was happening, not just with Salvatore, but with everybody that Barbara ended up starting a relationship with. And reportedly, Stefano was really open to all of his wife's lovers. It was reported that he would even bring them coffee while they were in bed. So Barbara, Stefano's wife, and her lovers are in bed, in the marital bed. And I believe that Stefano probably wasn't in there with them. And he would bring them coffee in the morning, like, good morning, sunshines. Here's some caffeine. Oh, do cafe to start your day. Here you go. And that's odd, but okay. I mean, maybe he was just a very open-minded person, or maybe he understood that there was things his wife wanted that he couldn't give her. Now, around Christmas time of 1962, Barbara Locci gave birth to a son named Natalino. And literally no one in town believed that kid was Stefano Mele's son. No one. Most likely, Natalino's father was Salvatore Vinci. So frustrated by Stefano's apathy in what Barbara was doing, his father kicked the married couple and their young son out of his house. Basically, he was like, you guys do what you got to do, but this is embarrassing us all, and I'm not going to stand idly by and watch my son, be made a fool of, and by default, me and my family be made a fool of. So Stefano, Barbara, Natalino, and get this, Salvatore Vinci, they all moved into an apartment together. They continued living together, and the affair continued until the summer of 1968, when Barbara took up with Salvatore's married brother, Francesco Vinci. So Francesco was known to be cocky and have a lot of swagger, as well as a tendency towards violence. And he and Barbara would publicly flaunt their relationship at a bar right outside of Florence that was known sort of as an unofficial meeting place for many Sardinian-based criminals. And yes, there were some immigrants who came over from Sardinia that didn't have the best intentions of making a new, fresh life on the Italian mainland, and they took part in a lot of schemes and plots, mainly kidnapping for ransoms, and if the ransom wasn't paid quickly enough, these same criminals would be known to have no problem killing their victims, whether those victims were children, women, etc. So basically, Francesco Vinci loves hanging out at this bar with all of these Sardinian criminals, and he takes part in some criminal activities as well, but nothing like kidnapping and murder as far as we know, at least at that time. He was more into stealing, especially livestock and animals. He had a big business going where he would steal somebody's sheep, goats, cows, whatever, and then sell them in different areas for, a profit. And by this point, Barbara Locci had been with all three of the Vinci brothers. She was with the oldest brother, Giovanni, very shortly after the Vinci brothers arrived in the Florence area. And then she was with Salvatore, the middle brother, for quite a while. And then she was with Francesco. And there seemed to be a difference between Francesco and her other affairs, because what Francesco and Barbara had was toxic and passionate all at once. And it's very likely that Francesco fell in love with Barbara Locci because he seemed to have a hard time letting her go, and he was very possessive of her. He really didn't want her seeing other men, even though he knew that she had already taken up with both of his brothers. But apparently they had a big fight at the bar one night. Barbara was getting mouthy, and Francesco was like, he's an Italian man, very, very masculine, very much into the patriarchy, and you must respect me. And basically Francesco was like, you're not going to talk to me like that in front of my boys. And he stripped her naked and threw her out in the streets outside of the bar with no clothes on, which seems counterproductive for a man who doesn't want his married girlfriend to be seeing other men because you just threw her outside completely naked. But either way, this kind of left a bad taste in Barbara's mouth. understandably, and she ended up starting another fling with another man in August of 1986. And this man was 29-year-old Antonio Lobianco, a married father of three from Sicily. And the way that Barbara and Lobianco met was because Antonio Lobianco was working with Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele, and Antonio had been invited over to the Mele household to inspect their roof because he was doing some work on the roof of the apartment building that they lived in. And basically, after meeting one or two times, Barbara and Antonio, they had some, chemistry. There was an undeniable physical attraction, and they were like, it's on. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. And apparently, Antonio went into the bar where Francesco hung out, and he challenged Francesco. Francesco was like, oh, I heard you're talking to my woman. And Antonio was like, I am. What are you going to do about it? This was before Antonio and Barbara had consummated their relationship. But Antonio was basically like, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to be in her bed within a week. I wonder if Francesco stripped Antonio naked and threw him out into the street, or if he just reserves that sort of treatment for women who cannot defend themselves. But anyways, let's go to the date of Thursday, August 21st, 1968. On this day, Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele, was working at a construction site between Signa and the neighboring town of Prato, and apparently and allegedly he fell ill. He had heartburn, he had stomach pains, he couldn't stop vomiting, allegedly, and so Stefano was given a ride home on the motorized scooter of a work colleague named Giuseppe Barranca. Now, Giuseppe Barranca, who was a coworker of Stefano's, also happened to be the brother of Barbara Loci's lover, Antonio Lobianco's wife. So everybody's sort of connected here, and you're going to see this. Like if we were trying to create a visual representation of the people in this case and how they were connected, there would just be lines connecting everybody to everybody. So when Stefano came home sick from work, which, by the way, he had never done before, although I will say Stefano Mele had a hard time holding a job, so he would get odd jobs as a bricklayer, as a laborer, as a construction worker here and there, and he would work these jobs for a month or two, and then he would get laid off, or the job would be completed, and he would have to find another job, which is one of the main reasons why this family was always struggling with money. But he had never come home sick from work before. So he comes home sick from work, and his wife, Barbara, and their son, Natalino, were home. And Stefano went right to bed. But that afternoon, two people stopped by to visit. One was Barbara's lover, Antonio Lobianco, who came to see Barbara and make plans to pick her up that evening because they were going to go see a movie. The other man who stopped by was named Carmelo Cutrona, and he stopped by at the same time that Antonio Lobianco was there, and allegedly Carmelo was there to check on Stefano's health. But we'll find out later that Carmelo was also a previous lover of Barbara Loci's, and he had not been super happy to see Antonio there that day making plans with her. And apparently he expressed this to Barbara's husband, Stefano, which is the weirdest dynamic, Like I can just see this Carmelo guy, he's walking in. Antonio and Barbara are in the kitchen kind of making eyes at each other, flirting, and Carmelo's pissed. And so he goes into Stefano's bedroom. Stefano's in bed sick, and he sits down and he's like, do you believe that Barbara's out there just flirting with this man? Like, what's going on? She's already found someone else. Like, I can't believe she got over me so quick. And Stefano's just like, yeah, man, totally understand your frustration. What? So anyways, but according to Stefano Mele, Carmelo was there to complain about Barbara's new boyfriend and to also check on Stefano's health and to also kind of talk about how he was planning to go into Florence that next week and look to buy a car. A lot of people in La Strada do not have cars, so they'll either get around on bikes or motorized scooters. Now, that same afternoon, after he left Barbara's house, Antonio Lobianco was asked by his brother-in-law, Giuseppe, if they wanted to, get together that night. But Antonio told Giuseppe that he could not because he already had plans with his new lover, Barbara, who he'd only been seeing for a month. Now, keep in mind, this is once again a very public affair because Antonio Lobianca's brother-in-law, who's his wife's brother, knows that Antonio and Barbara are like getting it on now. But, I guess it's just boys will be boys kind of mentality. At 9:30 p.m. that night, Antonio Lobianca pulled up to the Malay home to pick up Barbara. But while he was waiting for her to come out of the apartment, Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino, who'd been playing in the street with other children, he climbed into the back seat of Antonio's white Alfa Romeo Giulietta. Now, Natalino had met Antonio a few times before this, and he called him uncle. Natalino did this with all of his mother's boyfriends, so obviously Antonio's not actually his uncle, but that's what the kid called every single man that his mother brought around him. So Barbara comes out, she sees Natalino in the backseat of the car, and she tried to convince him to get out of the car and join his sick father inside. But the boy refused, so the couple decided to just take Natalino with them. They all drove to the Piazza Cavour, where they saw the movie Naked for a Fistful of Heroes at the local movie theater. This movie allegedly started at 10:30 p.m. and the manager of the theater, his name was Elio Ruggio, he remembered seeing Barbara looking at a movie poster around 10:10 p.m. while the man that she was with entered the bar. Ruggio also saw Barbara and Antonio purchasing tickets, which she paid for at 10:15 p.m. But the odd thing was, he didn't remember seeing little Natalino with them ever. He said the film was not intended for anyone under the age of 14, so he wouldn't have allowed the young boy to watch it if he had seen him. Barbara only purchased 2 tickets, and he watched her and Antonio walk into the movie theater alone. This is a big, mysterious part of this whole case, and you'll understand why in a little bit. So the movie's runtime was about 90 minutes, and afterwards, Barbara and Natalino were driven by Antonio towards Via di Castelletti, and they turned right after crossing a bridge near a cemetery, and then they traveled along a dirt road that ran parallel to a small stream. Natalino had fallen asleep on the short 10 to 15 minute drive from the theater, and the new couple were eager to have some, alone time. So Antonio parked about 100 yards off the paved road with the back of his car facing the road. It's estimated that they arrived at their parking spot at around 12:20 a.m. Now, just over a mile away, a man named Francesco Di Felice was up late. He was getting a glass of water for one of his children when he heard a knock at the door, and he peered outside to see a small boy standing on his front porch. This boy was Natalino Mele. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when Francesco Di Felice heard this knock on his door. In fact, it was exactly 2 a.m. because he remembered hearing the knock and saying, "It's very late for anybody to be at my door, much less up. I wouldn't be up if my kid didn't need a drink of water." And he looked at the clock and saw that it was 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. on the dot. So through the door, Natalino told Francesco his name and asked if he could bring him home to his father. He said his father was sick in bed, but his mother and his uncle were dead in their car. And Natalino said, "Listen, my mom and uncle are dead. My father's sick. I need you to drive me home. I'm cold and I'm tired, and I want to go home." Now, thinking there had been a car accident, Francesco Di Felice, he opened the front door and found Natalino outside unharmed, but he was wearing socks with no shoes. Once inside the house, Natalino tried to describe what had happened, telling Di Felice, quote, "It was dark. All the plants were moving. There was no one there. I was so scared. To give myself courage, I said my prayers. I started singing. My mother died. My uncle died." End quote. Confused, Di Felice tried to comfort the small boy, telling him that he was probably wrong. His mother and uncle were most likely just asleep, not dead. But Natalino, with a grave expression, insisted that they were dead. They were really dead. He said he had touched his mother's hand and arm, and there was no doubt in his mind. Natalino was taken by Di Felice and his landlord, Marcello Minetti, to the police station in Signa to report what had happened, and they all returned to the house together along with police officer Mario Giacomini. At 3:15 a.m., the group followed Natalino's directions to the spot where he said the car was parked that contained his dead mother and his dead uncle, and there they found Antonio Lobianca's vehicle exactly as the 6-year-old had told them they would. Mario Giacomini called for backup, and by 3:30 a.m., a major police presence descended on the isolated dirt road next to the small stream. Based on identification found in a wallet and a purse in the vehicle, the suspects were identified as 32-year-old Barbara Locci and 29-year-old Antonio Lobianco. Now, All of the doors and windows on the car were closed, except for the right rear door, which was slightly ajar, along with the right rear window, which was open 3 centimeters, and the left rear window, which was half opened. Antonio was lying on his back on the front right seat, which would have been the passenger seat, and that seat was fully reclined. He had his hands on his pants, with the pants unzipped and unbuttoned, and he was only wearing his left shoe. Barbara Locci was in the driver's seat, although she could not have been in that position when she'd been shot. Her seat was semi-reclined, and her head was resting on her left shoulder with her hands hanging limply at her sides. A broken gold chain was found on the floor of the car, and a section of this chain remained around Barbara's neck, trapped in the folds of her skin. Her clothes were disheveled, and the skirt of her colorful dress was pulled up so far she was almost completely exposed. She had no shoes on. They were later found underneath the front seat, and her son Natalino's shoes were found in the back seat. Now, when police opened the left passenger side door, one man's left shoe fell out, and they also located a green coin purse and a handkerchief in the space between the seat and the door. So this purse was Barbara Locci's, and this, amongst many other things, convinced law enforcement that Barbara had not been in the driver's seat when they had been attacked. She had most likely been in the passenger seat. Also, Barbara had sustained 2 shots to the back of her body, and when police found her, her body was in the driver's seat with her back completely flush against the seat, so that couldn't have possibly happened. So they know that these bodies were moved after death. Now, the police did notice that the green purse was open and someone had clearly rifled through it and looked through it, yet there was nothing missing from it, not even 25,000 lira. And this was not an insignificant sum of money at that time, and this would not have been an insignificant sum of money to Barbara's family, who were financially strapped. Now, they found 22 caliber shell casings in and around the vehicle, and when Barbara was being examined by the medical examiner, 2 more shell casings fell out of her clothes. The time of death for Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianca was estimated to be at around 12:15, 12:30, most likely 12:30. They didn't know exactly when they'd left the movie theater. They didn't know exactly when they'd arrived at this spot, but they did know that it was probably between midnight and 12:30 that the murders happened. Now, at 7 a.m., police knocked on the door of Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele, and they said that it seemed like he was expecting them. So Stefano and Barbara and their son lived in a house that was split up into apartments. They lived in the upper apartment, and so police approached the home that the apartment was located in, and before they even knocked on the door or let anyone know that they were there, Stefano popped his head out of the top window, and he was like, "Oh, hey guys," kind of like he was watching out of the window to see them pull up. And this is 7 a.m., so it's kind of early. It's kind of early for me. They also noticed that Stefano was awake and he was dressed, and reportedly he had grease all over his hands. Now, it doesn't appear that Stefano had the kind of grease on his hands that you would get from working on cars, like a car mechanic's grease. It seemed more like this grease was probably made from, like lard or animal fat, the kind of grease that would be baked with or cooked with. Now, the police report claims that when Stefano was told about what had happened to his wife and her lover, he seemed unfazed, as if he didn't care. He was more interested in making sure the police knew that he'd been homesick all day and all night the previous day. He had not left the apartment at all after 10 p.m. Now, eventually, Stefano did inquire about his 6-year-old, Natalino, and the police report states, quote, "He finally asks for news on his son, but in such a way that he clearly suggests he already knows his fate," end quote. Now, at the police station, Stefano started talking about his wife Barbara and her known affairs, which was something he said he had no issue with. He gave a list of men that he knew his wife had been with, and he even said he was aware that she'd gone to the movies with one of her new boyfriends, who he knew only as Enrico. Stephanie said that both Enrico, who's Antonio Lobianca, by the way, and another man, Carmela Cutrana, had been to his house the day before, the afternoon of the 21st. And he told the police, "Listen, Carmela Cutrana can testify about how sick I was because we were together for an hour and he saw me in bed. I was sick." But Then Stefano tells the police, Carmelo also did get a bit jealous when he saw that Antonio was with Barbara. So just gonna leave that there for you. Now, at this point, Stefano told the police that he also knew Barbara had carried on affairs with all three of the Vinci brothers, and he was specifically suspicious of Francesco more than anyone because allegedly Francesco had been very possessive and controlling and had threatened to kill Barbara Locci the past June, telling her that it would be over for her if she saw any other men besides himself. The police brought Francesco Vinci in for an interview, and he admitted that he had had an affair with Barbara, but it had been over for a while and he was on good terms with everyone in the Mele household. Not only had Francesco not seen Barbara for a week, but he'd been at home with his wife, Vitalia Muscus, from 10 p.m. until the following morning. Now, Vitalia supported her husband's alibi and also admitted that she was well aware of his relationship with Barbara Locci. And we're going to find out that she was very aware of this relationship and this affair, to the point where it landed her husband Francesco in prison or jail for a few days. Next, the police questioned Carmelo Cotrona, who vehemently denied any affair with Barbara Locci, and he said that on the evening of the 21st, he'd been at the movies with his uncle, Antonio Cannizaro, and once they returned home, he did not leave again. Now, this uncle testified that Carmelo was with him that night at the movies, and Carmelo's family at home supported his alibi that he got home from the movies and didn't leave again. Now, this same day, a paraffin glove test was performed on all three men, Stefano Mele, Francesco Vinci, and Carmelo Cotrona. Now, this test is also known as a dermal nitrate test, and it's not really used anymore, but back in the day, it was a forensic procedure that they used to detect the presence of gunpowder on someone's hands. The suspect's hands are going to be dipped into a paraffin wax, and once that wax hardens, it's going to be tested for nitrates that are found in gunpowder. So an area of Stefano Mele's right hand tested positive for these nitrates. And if you watch on the video right now, I am showing you the exact area that tested positive. This was an area of approximately 3 centimeters corresponding to the fold of skin between his thumb and forefinger. And this is important. This is the area where if you were holding a semi-automatic gun and shooting it, this is where the emissions would be basically exhausted onto your hand. So it kind of looked bad for him as far as whether or not he had handled a gun recently. Now, these tests were done 16 hours after the murders happened, so obviously that's going to always call into question the results. And in general, paraffin glove tests aren't really used anymore because they're not super consistent or reliable when testing for gunshot residue, because the nitrates in the gunshot residue and the nitrates that would be tested for in these paraffin glove tests could be found in many other substances. For instance, both of Carmelo Cotrone's palms tested positive for gunshot residue, but this was not considered to be a major red flag or evidence of anything because Carmelo worked at a factory, I think it was a shoe factory, and the same nitrates that were tested for were used in that factory. But Francesco Vinci, he had no traces of anything on his hands, so his paraffin glove test came back completely negative. Now, the homes of all three of these men were searched to locate the murder weapon, which would eventually be identified as a .22 caliber Beretta, but nothing was found at any of their homes, in any of their vehicles, at any of their workplaces, and so all three men were released from police custody. Stefano Mele was allowed to go home, and he was given custody of his son, Natalino, so they could spend the night together, but the police told him, hey, tomorrow morning, you got to come back in. So the next morning at 11 a.m., Stefano Mele went back into the police station, and this time he brought a man with him named Piero Mucciarini. So Piero was Stefano's brother-in-law. Piero was married to Stefano's sister, Antonetta, and so Antonetta came over to watch Natalino while her brother went into the police station, and Antonetta's husband, Piero, went with Stefano to the police station, and his purpose there was to act as a translator between Stefano and the police, since Stefano mainly spoke in his Sardinian dialect and his Italian was rough. I believe that Piero was also there to sort of keep an eye on things and make sure that Stefano didn't say too much, because remember, Stefano's not completely up there when it comes to intellectual processing. So that And plus the language barrier, Piero maybe wanted to make sure that nobody was taking advantage of his brother-in-law. However, Piero worked as a baker overnight, and at some point after a few hours of being there with Stefano, Piero had to go so he could get some sleep because he'd worked the night before and he had to go back to work that night. Now, during this police interview, Stefano sort of flipped the script. He didn't focus on Francesco Vinci, the youngest Vinci brother. Instead, he started talking to police about another brother, Salvatore Vinci. Stefano said that he was well aware since 1960 Salvatore and Barbara had something going on because they had both admitted to it, and he'd personally seen them out together more than once, and Salvatore would sometimes spend the night at their home. Stefano had been admitted to the hospital in February of that year after being in a car accident. And we have to talk about this accident because it's actually important to our story, so we'll come back to it. But allegedly, while Stefano was in the hospital with a broken femur, his son Natalino told him while he was gone his mother had brought Uncle Salvatore over and the two had shared a bed that night while Natalino slept in a cot in another room. All right, so let's talk about the car accident really quick because technically it's not a car accident. Technically, Stefano was on a motorbike when he got hit by a car, but he wasn't alone on this motorbike, okay? This happened in February of 1968, so the same year as the murders. And this is also going to be evidence to you that Stefano doesn't really have any bad blood or ill will to any of the men that his wife has publicly, been sleeping with, because he's not on this motorbike alone. He is on the motorbike with Francesco Vinci, the youngest Vinci brother. And Francesco's driving because it's his motorbike. It's a Lambretta motorbike. And Stefano's on the back, and they get hit by a car. Stefano gets real messed up. He breaks his femur. He's got to be hospitalized. But thankfully, the driver of the car, which I believe it was a Fiat 500, he had insurance. And he was like, don't worry, I'll take care of your expenses. I have insurance. Now, at that time, having insurance wasn't mandatory. It was just kind of like if you felt like it, and if you thought you might be hitting people or running into things and you might need to make claims, you could get it. If not, you didn't need to, but then you would be responsible if you got sued because something like this happened and somebody's in the hospital and you have to now pay all of these, medical expenses and give them reimbursements and stuff. But here's the twist. The Lambretta, this motorbike, was not only not in Francesco Vinci's name, it was in Stefano Mele's name because Francesco had needed to get a loan from Stefano to buy the bike, and he had put it in his name because Francesco didn't have a license. But Francesco didn't have a license. So if he was the one driving, the insurance wouldn't cover it. So Francesco told his brother, Salvatore, to basically pretend that he had been the one driving the motorbike when the claim was made in June of 1968. And actually, Stefano Mele would get a pretty good settlement from this. I believe it was 450 or 480,000 liras, which was a lot of money to Stefano. So what we need to understand here is this Lambretta motorbike was purchased with a loan that Stefano Mele gave Francesco. Francesco did have a driver's license, so when he and Stefano got hit, he made Salvatore file the claim. Now, this insurance claim is going to pay out in June of 1968, just a few months before the murders, and it's 480,000 lira. And all of this money, it's going to Stefano because he was the one that was injured and because the bike was registered in his name. 480,000 lira is not a small amount of money. And to somebody like Stefano, really anybody in La Straisigna at this time, that was a ton of money. So right now in US dollars, that would be about $15,000, $16,000. And this was probably more money than Stefano had ever had at one time in his entire life. So let's get back to Stefano's statements to the police about Salvatore Vinci. So Stefano said that he knew that Salvatore and Barbara had something going on. He also knew that Salvatore had been threatening Barbara. Not only had Stefano personally heard these threats made more than once, but his wife had told him she was scared of her lover. And she knew that one of these days, Salvatore would kill her. Stefano said that a month before Barbara's murder, Salvatore had showed up to their house asking for a loan of 150,000 lira. And during that same time period, he'd gotten a loan of about the same amount from Barbara. So overall, allegedly, Salvatore owed Barbara and her husband Stefano about $300,000 or lira. And it wasn't the worst thing, I guess, because Stefano did have all of that money from the insurance payout. But when Stefano tried to get the money back from Salvatore, that's when things kind of went downhill. Stefano claimed that when he asked for the money back, he was told by Salvatore, listen, I don't have this money right now, but you know what? I know that you're sick of your wife. You're sick of being embarrassed. You're sick of her having sex with all these other men. And why don't I kill her for you? And then we'll just call it even. Like, you paid me this money to take out your wife. And then we'll just, we'll be fair and square at that point. And Stefano claimed that when Salvatore said this to him, he was shocked. He was like, what? Absolutely not. He was like, I don't want to see my wife dead, even if she does publicly cheat on me, even if she does embarrass me, even if she hasn't touched me in over a decade, even if she spends all of my hard-earned money on her boyfriends. Why would I want her dead? That doesn't make any sense. I did not want anything to do with this. That's what Stefano told the police. He's like, listen, I did not make a deal with this dude. I did not say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. We did not shake. We did not sign anything. I had no idea what was going to happen. Stefano said, I told Salvatore, don't do that. Don't do that, this isn't what I want. And then they sort of parted ways. But Stefano did also say he was scared of Salvatore because everyone knew Salvatore had killed his first wife, who also happened to be named Barbara. Actually, people called her Barbarina because she was so little. Barbarina means little Barbara. And the weird part is, there was some truth to this rumor. Like I said, the Vinci brothers had grown up in the isolated Sardinian village of Villisidro. This was a place that most Sardinians believed to be haunted and cursed. They refer to it as a country of shadows and witches. The three brothers were raised there, and they would go on to gain quite negative reputations in their hometown. And this kind of started after the eldest brother, Giovanni, was accused of raping his sister. And then the middle brother, Salvatore, he married 19-year-old Barbara Stiri. Now, Barbara had been betrothed to another man. She was in love with another man, but she followed the orders of her father, who was close to the Vinci family. They had kind of already planned on this happening, and it didn't really matter what Barbara wanted. In 1959, Barbara gave birth to a son named Antonio, and the following year, she was found dead in her bed. The authorities claimed that young Barbara had taken her own life by turning on the propane gas and then basically just inhaling it in until she fell asleep and didn't wake up. But no one in town really believed this story because rumor had it Barbara had been in bed with her very young son, Antonio, and someone crept into the room, took Antonio out of the bed, crept back out, and left Barbara to die there. Everyone was sure that Salvatore Vinci had killed his young wife, who was still in love with another man. He couldn't take the shot to his ego that he wasn't Barbarina's first choice. Now, scandal after scandal is happening, first with Giovanni and his sister, now Salvatore, and Barbarina, and the youngest brother, Francesco. He didn't have anything specifically that anyone was trying to, burn him at the stake for, but he was known to have a very violent temper. He was a womanizer. He was known to be kind of violent with the women he was with, especially if they rejected him. And he was known to be really adept with a knife. So the town rose up against the Vinci brothers. They were like, get out of here. You guys are trouble. You just bring chaos wherever you go. We want you gone. So the brothers fled to the mainland of Italy, which is where they met Barbara Locci, which is when everyone's lives changed forever. So Stefano Mele is telling the police, listen, I know Salvatore killed his wife with gas, and I know that he tried more than once to kill me in my sleep by turning the propane gas on in the dead of night when I was in bed. Now, Stefano does not actually specify whether or not Salvatore was living with him at this time when he tried to kill Stefano, or whether he was spending the night with Barbara when this happened, because then you'd assume that Barbara and Natalino and Salvatore would also be in the house, or if Salvatore was just sneaking in and turning the gas on and then sneaking out, which in that case, how is Stefano alive? But regardless, this is what Stefano claims. During this second interview, Stefano changed his story quite a bit, and this is going to be something that's as common to him as breathing. He changes his story constantly. Stefano now stated that he had actually not been home all night long. He was bored and lonely, so around 11:30 p.m. on the night of August 21st, he decided to take a walk. And as he walked, he conveniently just happened to run into Salvatore Vinci. And Salvatore was like, "Hey, how you doing? How's Barbara, your wife? How's your son, Natalino?" And Stefano informed Salvatore that his son and his wife had left that evening to go see a movie with Barbara's boyfriend, Antonio. But actually, Stefano didn't refer to Antonio as Antonio. He called him Enrico because for some reason, that is what he thinks his name is, even though Stefano has met this person more than once, and it's not his name. That's what Stefano called Antonio, Enrico, which is weird. I have a theory about why he did that, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Stefano claims that when Salvatore heard what Barbara was up to, he was furious. He reacted to this news very angrily, and he asked Stefano, "Why do you put up with this? Why don't you do something?" And when he was asked why he didn't do something, Stefano allegedly responded, quote, "How can I, without anything in hand, knowing that Enrico practiced boxing? I have a small weapon," end quote. I know it's like an Italian translation, which also is a Sardinian translation into Italian and then Italian into English. So the translation's probably off. But just to hear Stefano say, like, "How can I go up against Enrico, who practices boxing, when I have a small weapon?" What was he talking about? What small weapon is he referring to? What is he referring to? What are you calling small, Stefano? What are you calling small that you're comparing to your wife's new boyfriend? So allegedly, according to Stefano, Salvatore was like, "Well, let's just kill them then. You don't have to worry about fist fights or what weapons you have, whatever, if we just kill them." So Salvatore told Stefano to get into his car, a Fiat 600. And Salvatore's the only Vinci brother that has a car. The other two only have bikes or motorbikes. And Stefano, Mili, he doesn't have a car either. He doesn't even have a driver's license. He doesn't have a motorbike. He just has a regular bike. So Salvatore's like the only person in this scenario, in this web of characters, that has an actual vehicle. So Salvatore says, "Jump in my car." Him and Stefano get in the car. The two men drove to the movie theater where they located Antonio Lobianco's white Alfa Romeo in the parking lot. They sat outside the movie theater. They waited for Antonio, Barbara, and Natalino to leave the movie, and then they followed the white Alfa Romeo to the spot where Antonio, Barbara, and Natalino would park, with Natalino reportedly asleep in the back seat and Antonio and Barbara getting busy in the front seats. So once they were at that location by the stream on the dirt path, Stefano claims that Salvatore handed him a bag. And Salvatore said, "Inside this bag, there's a gun with 8 bullets loaded into it. Go ham." Stefano told the police that when he approached the car, he saw Antonio laying on the reclined front seat with Barbara on top of him. This made him angry, so Stefano fired all 8 shots into his wife and her lover, killing them immediately. Now, this is the weird part of the story because Stefano claims that his son, Natalino, was asleep in the back seat, but he didn't know that Natalino was back there, and Natalino didn't wake up while Stefano was shooting at Antonio and Barbara. Natalino only woke up afterwards while Stefano was like moving their bodies around. And Natalino woke up and said, "Daddy." And then Stefano looked at him and panicked. He fled the scene, throwing the gun to the side of the road and returning to Salvatore's car. He then claims that Salvatore drove him to a bridge, and from there, Stefano walked the rest of the way home. Now, curious about exactly what had happened that night because this story wasn't making sense. None of this story was making sense. The police brought Stefano back to the scene of the double murder. And they asked him to basically not only walk them through what he had done, like tell them what he had done, where he had fired from, but basically recreate it for them in front of him. And reportedly, this was just a hysterical situation. Stefano was being like overly dramatic, so I'm going to have to show you because the way that this was explained was by the Italian YouTube channel I've been following, and he just made it sound so funny. But basically, Stefano was like doing this. Like when he was walking up to the car, this is how he was showing the police he did it. So I guess Stefano was being all dramatic, you know, he was being super like kind of what he would see in the movies, like somebody like creeping around. And you can tell in one of these pictures of the recreation, there's a dude in the car while Stefano's doing the recreation, and he's a detective, and he's laughing. He's laughing. He's clearly very amused by something, and this is probably what it was. Not only was Stefano's recreation absolutely ridiculous, but it just didn't add up. The police report stated, quote, "We immediately took him to the crime scene, but he made us go there the wrong way. When he got there, he didn't seem lost. We put a weapon in his hand so that he could reconstruct the events of that night. What was my impression? In my opinion, he didn't even know how to handle it." End quote. That's what the police officer is saying, that it just didn't seem like Stefano had ever held a gun in his hand before. At the crime scene, Stefano illustrated how he had crawled on his hands and knees to the car approaching the passenger side, and he claimed that the window on the passenger side seat had been open, and that's what he shot through. But in fact, that window had not been open at all. It was the two back windows that had been open, and one was only open about 3 centimeters. So Stefano wasn't even able to reconstruct the crime scene properly based on the evidence. He claimed he had fired through a window that he could not have possibly fired through. He was making statements that couldn't have possibly been true, like Natalino didn't wake up when the shots were fired. And if you fired 8 shots, you'd think the kid would have woken up at some point during those 8 shots. Why would he wake up afterwards and not during the murders? And although the police doubted, based on Stefano's over-dramatizing of the murders and his awkward way with, a weapon of any kind, they really doubted that he had been the one to do this. But it was true. Stefano seemed to know things about what had happened that night, which he could have only known if he'd been there. For instance, the papers had reported that Barbara and Antonio had suffered 3 gunshots each, meaning only 6 shots had been fired. But Stefano told the police that he'd emptied the magazine, 8 shots in all, 4 in each body. And it turned out, during the autopsies, the medical examiner and then the police realized that in fact both Barbara and Antonio had been shot 4 times each. So Stefano knew how many bullets had been used even before law enforcement did. He also said that his son Natalino had woken up while he, Stefano, was trying to move the bodies, and he had moved Barbara, his wife Barbara, by grabbing the top portion of her dress and kind of situating her into a different seat. And as he did that, he claimed that her skirt had gone quite high up, and so he had sort of rearranged her to make sure that she appeared more modest when her body was found. He said her panties had been down and he pulled them up, and then he tried to sort of like cover her legs with her skirt. But as we know, when Barbara was found, her skirt was pulled pretty much all the way up, leaving nothing to the imagination, and she was not wearing underwear. Most importantly, though, the murder weapon was just nowhere to be found, right? Because Stefano showed the police exactly where he allegedly threw the gun when he ran away, but the grass between that dirt road where Antonio LoBianca had parked and the stream that was right next to the dirt road, there was just a small stripe of grass there, and it was cut short, well-groomed, no weapon was located there. So they also dredged the stream and the river that the stream connected to see if the gun had accidentally been thrown in the water, and maybe Stefano just didn't know it had gone in the water, and so it had ended up at the bottom of the stream or the bottom of the river, but no weapon was found there either. And they went through the riverbed, they dredged it, they did everything. They sent divers down there. No gun was found. So even though a lot of things about the crime scene and the way Stefano said it had gone down didn't make sense, he had confessed to killing his wife and her lover, and so he was arrested and charged with this double murder before being placed in prison at the Murate in Florence. Now, at 1:20 a.m. on August 24th, Salvatore Vinci was brought in for a police interview, and the police basically told him, listen, Stefano's pointed the finger at you. He says you were with him when these 2 people were killed, and Salvatore said, absolutely not. I had nothing to do with what had happened to Barbara and Antonio, and on the evening of the 21st, I got out of work around 8:30 p.m. I went home, changed quickly, then I went to a local sports bar where I met up with 2 friends, and at around 10:30, we left the sports bar, we went to a nightclub, we stayed there till midnight, and then we all went home. Now, reportedly, Salvatore's 2 buddies that he'd been with that night confirmed his alibi, and they told the police that Salvatore hadn't left their side from 10:15 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. Now, here's the interesting thing. One of these buddies, one of these friends of Salvatore, his name was Nicola Antonucci, and Antonucci was not in the best place in life at that time. He didn't have a job, he didn't have a home, and he had just met Salvatore Vinci a few days before the murders. Initially, Antonucci was a bit confused, and he told police he'd been with Salvatore on Tuesday night, and the police officer questioning him had to help make him realize that they were talking about Wednesday night, not Tuesday night. And then finally, Antonucci was like, oh yeah, it was Wednesday night. So technically, Salvatore had an alibi for that night, but we're going to find out years and years later that wasn't necessarily the truth. Salvatore's home and car were searched, but once again, police found no murder weapon and no evidence that he'd been connected to the crime. Salvatore also admitted to having an affair with Barbara Locci, and he said their relationship had come to an end when he'd gotten married, but the previous January, they had started back up again after he'd offered her husband Stefano some odd jobs here and there. Salvatore also knew that Barbara had been with his brother Francesco after Salvatore's initial affair with Barbara. In fact, Francesco's wife had called the police and filed a report accusing her husband of abandoning herself and their 3 young children to live with Barbara, and this had landed Francesco behind bars for a short time. I guess abandoning your wife and children to live with another woman who's also married is not legal, or wasn't at that time. It would get you a few days in jail, I suppose. But during that time, while Francesco was behind bars, Salvatore sidled up to Barbara and he was like, hey, my brother's, he's not here, right? What he can't see, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. Let's get busy. And she told him no. She said she was afraid to sleep with him again because Francesco had made it clear to her that she should not be seeing any other men, and she was afraid of what he would do if and when he found out, and he always seemed to find out. And this probably was because Barbara also claimed to Salvatore that while they'd been together on more than one occasion, she'd seen his brother Francesco following them. Now, you may wonder, why is Salvatore throwing his brother Francesco under the bus? Well, at this time, he's being accused by Stefano, the victim's wife, of being his accomplice, of being part of these murders. So he might be just trying to find any other option. And so we can, I suppose, understand his willingness to be honest with the police about Francesco and his jealousy with Barbara Locci. However, that same day, Stefano Mili was questioned again, and the police specifically wanted to know, where is the murder weapon? Where's the Beretta pistol? Because remember, Stefano claimed he'd thrown it, but they couldn't find it anywhere. And this is when Stefano changed his story again. And he said, listen, you're right. You're not going to find it because I didn't throw that gun at all. I gave it back to Salvatore after the murders. So when Stefano Mili was told that Salvatore Vinci had an alibi, unsurprisingly, at this point, he changed his story again. Now Stefano said that he'd been mistaken. He hadn't been with Salvatore Vinci the night of his wife's murder at all. He'd been with Francesco Vinci, and the only reason he told the police the wrong name was because he was scared of Francesco. So he told them Salvatore. Also, Stefano told the police that he didn't tell them about Francesco because after Barbara and Antonio were dead, Francesco had told him, listen, I don't care whose name comes out of your mouth, as long as it's not mine, okay? And apparently Francesco was very dangerous, had a lot of criminal powerful friends, and Stefano didn't want to cross him. But now Stefano claimed that Francesco's middle brother Salvatore, he had nothing to do with the double murder. He'd simply implicated him because he was salty about Salvatore and Barbara's lengthy love affair. And now the real culprit was Francesco. So before they talked to Francesco, the police decided to set up a meeting between Stefano and Salvatore at the police station. And when Salvatore walked into the room, Stefano fell onto his knees, sobbing and begging for his forgiveness, clutching at Salvatore's legs. Can you forgive me? Can you forgive me? And reportedly, Salvatore gave Stefano a long and hard look before leaving the room without saying a word. And then he went outside to the reporters and he was like, listen, this man has now vindicated me, but he pointed his finger at me falsely to begin with. Who would ever think that I could do this? Who would ever think that I could commit a crime like this? I had an alibi. You can't just go around accusing people. That man's crazy. Okay? Salvatore Vinci also told the police that he personally didn't know if his brother Francesco owned a gun, but he had heard from Francesco's wife that Francesco did have a gun and that he'd threatened his wife with it before. The wife also claimed that Francesco kept the gun in the locked toolbox on his Lambretta, which is a motorized scooter sort of thing, like a motorized bike thing. And the police did check the Lambretta and they saw that there was a compartment, but reportedly this compartment wasn't really big enough to hold a Beretta, so they kind of didn't take it seriously. But during Stefano Mele's trial, Francesco's wife would unequivocally deny that she'd ever made these statements to her brother-in-law, Salvatore. She had never told Salvatore that Francesco had a gun, that he kept it in his motorized scooter, or that he had threatened her with it before. Now, Stefano Mili would tell the police a slightly different version of events when he changed his story, now claiming that Salvatore had nothing to do with it, and it was Salvatore's younger brother, Francesco, who was actually responsible and with him on the evening when Barbara and her lover Antonio died. Stefano still claimed that he'd left his apartment that night after his wife and son had gone to the movies with Antonio because he was lonely and bored, but this time he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He didn't just happen to run into somebody who was willing to kill his wife. This time he was seeking out Francesco Vinci because apparently the two had talked about killing Barbara in the past. So, knowing where Francesco hung out, Stefano went to this bar, the criminal bar outside of Florence, and he waited outside of the bar for Francesco to leave. Now, the owner of this bar would later claim he didn't see Francesco or Stefano inside or outside of the bar that night at all. But this was the story that Stefano was now telling. He claimed that once Francesco exited the bar, Francesco was like, "How's Barbara? How's Natalino? How's the family?" And Stefano was like, "Oh, actually, my wife is with her boyfriend and they took my son to see a movie." And then Francesco got mad. He was like, "What? You're letting this woman just embarrass you and she's all over the place with everybody? Let's kill her." So they both jumped on Francesco's scooter, which, hasn't really panned out well for them to begin with. But anyways, they start driving, and Stefano claims that they went to a town called Calcania. And outside of the town, Francesco dropped Stefano off. He was like, "Get off the scooter, I'll be right back." And then Francesco continued on in the scooter. He was only gone about 10 or 15 minutes, and he reappeared. Stefano claims that Francesco did not at that time tell him where he had gone or what he had been doing, but later Francesco would tell Stefano that he had been retrieving the gun, but he still didn't tell him where he had gone or where he'd gotten the gun from. But when Francesco got back to where he left Stefano, he allegedly said, "Let's go to Signa." And then they drove to the movie theater. They laid in wait outside of the movie theater so they could follow Barbara and Antonio to their Lover's Lane location. And Stefano said that while they waited, they didn't talk much because they both knew the other's thoughts and intentions. But once, Stefano did ask out loud, "What do we do now?" And he claims Francesco Vinci responded, "I'll take care of it." Now, in this version of events, after they'd followed Antonio's white Giulietta to the dirt road, Francesco was the main shooter, and it was Francesco who moved the bodies around. And then young Natalino in the back seat woke up, said his father's name. Stefano heard him, and Stefano claimed, quote, "I was struck by a deep sense of shame and guilt. Instead of responding to my son and talking with him, I ran towards the scooter and set off on foot along the Provincial Road without bothering to wait for Francesco with the scooter, also for fear that people would see me." End quote. Stefano claimed that a little while later, Francesco Vinci pulled up on the scooter and told Stefano that he had dropped Natalino off at the house of a farmer up the road, and he warned Stefano that his son must not say a word about this to anyone. And so Stefano told the police, "Listen, I feel really bad about falsely accusing Salvatore Vinci. I hope it didn't cause him too much harm." But he insisted to the police that this time he was telling the truth. He promised. In fact, he told the police, "If you don't believe me, you can go and ask Natalino," which was convenient given the boy was 6 and Stefano had been allowed to spend the night with him before he'd been arrested the following day. So if there was any story that Stefano wanted Natalino to tell the police, he had most likely already had the opportunity to plant it into his head. On August 24th, 6-year-old Natalino was interviewed by the police, and he was asked about the night of the murders and what he remembered. And the boy had always claimed that he'd gotten from the car to Francesco Di Felice's house on foot, but the police had a hard time believing that such a young child would take the initiative. After waking up, being confused, disoriented, finding his mother dead in the car, and he would get out of the car in the dark of the night alone and walk away with no shoes on, alone. The police were like, we're really not buying it. Plus, it was like over a mile away. Natalino was wearing no shoes. The road he claimed to have walked was not paved. It was rough, and it was covered in these sharply pointed stones that would have caused injury to his feet, which he didn't have. There were no wounds or scratches on Natalino's feet, and he didn't even appear to be excessively tired. or worn out, even though he had taken such a long journey, which took over an hour, which also they said it shouldn't have taken him that long to get from the place of the car to the house, the white farmhouse where he ended up being. So a team of police officers led by Gaetano Ferraro brought Natalino to the scene, and they wanted to see if the boy could recreate the walk. And they start walking down this dirt path, and it was kind of clear and okay for about 300 meters. So if you were at the car, if you were at Antonio Lobianca's car, and you looked down that dirt path, it would look like it was a pretty, easy road to walk for about 300 meters. But they started off this journey in a police cruiser, and Natalino told the police, "You're not going to be able to drive down this road. There's mountains. There's mountains all over this road that you can't drive by. You have to walk around them." And the police were like, "Okay, dude, there's mountains, So Gaetano Ferraro and Natalino are walking down the road on foot. The police officers in the car are driving behind them. And as they take this journey, Gaetano Ferraro looks at Natalino and he's like, "See? Don't you see how this road here would be impossible to walk without shoes? Do you see how sharp the stones are? Do you see how jagged the road is? Like it's not a road you could comfortably walk without shoes on. You'd get marks on your feet. You would hurt your feet. Your socks would be ripped." Still, Natalino insisted that he had. He said, "This is the road I walked on, and I took it on foot." So they keep walking. The police car keeps driving. But about 700 meters down the road, they saw the mountains that Natalino had been referring to, which weren't actually mountains, but probably appeared to be mountains to a small boy. The police report stated, quote, "Large piles of gravel appeared in front of us all over the road in the shape of large cut stones that made it absolutely impossible to continue. In fact, the car absolutely could not continue due to the presence of piles and boulders and sharp mountain gravel recently unloaded waiting to be spread on the road's surface," end quote. At first, the police car tried to get around these piles of gravel. They got stuck, and a couple farmers had to come up and help pull their car out. And so the police car had to turn back. But Officer Ferrero continued on with Natalino on foot, and he continued trying to convince Natalino that he couldn't have walked this road without shoes on and alone. And at one point, Ferraro turned towards Natalino and told him, quote, "Be careful, Natalino. If you don't tell the truth, tonight in the dark, we will take the same route again, but without shoes, like that night," end quote. And that was when Natalino changed his story and remembered that he had not actually walked to the house. He'd ridden there on his father's back. He said, "My father gave me a piggyback ride to the house, and he sang to me while we walked." Natalino claimed that Stefano had placed him on a small bridge, and from this bridge, they could see the light of De Felice's home, the white farmhouse. And then Stefano returned to the car, and Natalino walked on towards the light, which is why the bottom of his socks did have some dirt on them. But once again, not the kind of dirt you would have seen if Natalino had walked the entire over a mile's journey from the car to De Felice's house. So after this, the police returned to Stefano, and they were like, "This is what your son said. This is what Natalino claims happened." And Stefano changed his story again. He said, "Okay, you're right. I did bring my son to the White House. And actually, now that I think about it, I didn't see Francesco Vinci that night at all. But I don't want to talk about it anymore." Stefano said he was tired. He wanted to be left alone. He'd been interrogated for days straight, and he just had nothing left to give, which totally relatable. On August 25th, Stefano Mele was left alone. He was given a chance to rest. He was not forced to speak to any police officers. But the next day, the police wanted to talk to him again. They wanted to know, okay, so what actually happened now? Because now you've completely wiped the slate clean, and we need to know, once again, were you there alone? Did you have an accomplice? What the hell happened to Natalino? How did he get to the farmhouse? They also confronted Stefano with the results of their paraffin glove test. And this is when Stefano finds out that Francesco Vinci's results had been negative, but Carmelo Cutrona's results had been positive. So, of course, now Stefano's going to blame Carmelo. But the way that Stefano did this, based on the transcript, it made it seem like he was super confused. He was sort of flying by the seat of his pants, as if he was no longer even attempting to accurately remember the events of that evening, but he was sort of trying to guess along with law enforcement. Like he was sort of trying to armchair detective it, solve the case with them. He said, someone must have been with me that night because I don't own a gun. I've never fired one. I don't know how to fire one. So somebody must have been with me that night, and it must have been Carmelo, right? Because he's got gunshot residue on his hands. And so the police asked him, do you want to confront Carmelo about being your accomplice that night? And Stefano said, quote, there is no need. If the findings are as you say, it means that Cutrona did it. The events unfolded as I reported in my latest version, except that instead of Francesco, Cutrona was there, end quote, which is super convenient, right? Because he's like, okay, you don't have to throw out everything I already said. Keep it exactly the same. Just replace the person that I said was there with a completely different person, which once again is going to call into question, how did you meet Carmelo? Because you said you went to the bar that Francesco hung out at. You said you all drove away on Francesco's scooter. You said Francesco had to leave you outside of some small town so he could go retrieve a gun. So what happened now with Carmelo Cutrona? Did all that same stuff happen? Was Carmelo on Francesco's bike? Was he hanging out at Francesco's bar? Tell us what's going on, because his family says he was home that night. Now, even though Stefano didn't think it was necessary to meet Cutrona face-to-face and confront him, the police set up a meeting between Stefano and Carmelo anyways. And reading the transcript, it actually seems like witnessing this exchange would have been a wild ride. It would have been a bit humorous. And luckily, I've got it right here. So Stefano says to Carmelo, remember that you came home that evening? And Carmelo says, when you were sick? And Stefano says to him, what did you talk about with my wife when you were alone with her? What did you talk about? And Carmelo responds, we talked about you. That's a lie. So Stefano says to Carmelo, didn't you ask her out that night? And Carmelo responds, never. And Stefano says, you went out with my wife many times, like everyone else. And Carmelo says, never, never. So then Stefano asks Carmelo, you went out and killed my wife that night. What time did you get back? And Carmelo said, got back? You are drunk. When I returned, I went to La Stracina with my uncle. Then I went to the cinema, then to the bar, and then home. Stefano says to Carmelo, where did we go? Carmelo responds, I didn't go anywhere with you. You are crazy. Stefano says to Carmelo, yes, you came. Where did we go? Where was my wife? And Carmelo responds to him, you're crazy. I didn't go with you. Stefano says to Carmelo, you killed her. Carmelo responds, you're crazy. You are crazy. You need to get sent to the mental hospital. Stefano responds to this, my wife went out with you many times. Carmelo says, I have never been out with your wife. Stefano responds to him, we've known each other since I was in Casalina. And then Carmelo responds to Stefano, you are crazy. You accuse people like nothing. Stefano says to Carmelo, that evening we left the Lambretta near the cemetery. The Lambretta is the motor scooter, remember. Carmelo responds, I have never gone anywhere with you. Stefano tells Carmelo, you did it out of jealousy. Carmelo responds, out of jealousy towards your wife? You're mad. And then Stefano said, what route did we take that evening? Carmelo once again responds, I didn't travel anywhere with you. Stefano says to Carmelo, we've taken that road many times. Which car did you see that evening? What license plate did he have? Carmelo responds, I didn't see any cars. I wasn't there with you. Stefano responds, you were there. You were there. Carmelo says, I wasn't there with you. Stefano says to Carmelo, you were there. We waited a while to take them out. You had the first idea of killing them. Then you took the gun out of the Lambretta. It was all of you. You wanted to get rid of her. Some guy was stalking another guy. Tell the truth. She's dead now. You got busy with her like everyone else. And then Carmelo responds, I have never had anything to do with your wife. Stefano tells him, after you killed them, you ran away. Tell the truth. Carmelo responds, what truth? Stefano tells him, the truth of that evening, of what we did together. Carmelo says, I've never had anything to do with you. Stefano says, yes, you've been there and done that. It was done and done well. Carmelo says, you have to say what you did. Stefano says, no, what we did together. Carmelo says, I know nothing and I know nothing now. Stefano responds to this saying, when what happened that evening happened, you took the Lambretta and ran away. So then the police ask Stefano, while he's having this conversation with Carmelo, what color was the Lambretta? Because Carmelo don't have a Lambretta scooter. Francesco does. Francesco Vinci, but not Carmela Cutrona. So they asked Stefano Mele what color was the Lambretta, and Stefano responds, I don't remember what color the Lambretta was. And then he says, this is the right man without a doubt. It is true that several times in the previous minutes I have declared that I was willing to support the confrontation with Francesco when I accused him, but I am convinced that I would have then lacked the courage because Francesco had nothing to do with this and he is innocent. However, as you are able to notice, I do not lack the courage to face Cutrona and always speak to him while looking him in the eyes. So it's funny because Stefano is like, where did we go that night? And Carmela's like, what are you talking about? I didn't go with you anywhere. And Stefano's like, you were there. Where did we go? What did we do? And Carmela's like, you're crazy. Like, you need help, right? And it's funny, but it's not funny because I do genuinely believe that Stefano had no memory of what had happened that night. I believe he was there, but I don't think he had an actual memory of what had happened that night, or he was too afraid to tell the police who had really done it. Now, the police must have agreed with Carmela Cutrona that something wasn't right with Stefano because they went to a judge who then ordered a psychiatric exam to be performed on Stefano. And when all was said and done, Stefano would undergo 3 psychiatric exams. Reports indicate that Stefano Mele was below average development and he was highly naive with respect to situations he found himself in. He was also diagnosed with something called medium-grade oligophrenia, which is apparently not only something I've never heard of, but a rare inherited metabolic issue that will first appear in childhood. And individuals who are affected by this condition are mentally deficient and they can't really comprehend the meaning and substance of things. They also show a frequent absence of purpose in certain acts that require intellectual processing. Now, at the end of the day, after an investigation into the Vinci brothers, as well as investigations into Barbara Locci's other alleged lovers, as well as investigations into the families of Stefano Mele and Barbara Locci, the police decided that only Stefano could have been responsible. He hadn't done it because he'd been jealous, but because he'd been broke. He'd always been broke. He'd always had a hard time with money, and his wife had spent all of his money on her lovers, specifically 480,000 lira that he'd gotten from the insurance claim from his motorbike accident in February of that year. Now, remember, that money had come to Stefano in June. This was a lot of money, and apparently Barbara kind of spent it all. Like, they had paid off their debt with the local grocery store. They had paid back some loans and things like that. But after all of that was said and done, there was still 400,000 lira that could not be located, by the way. So some of that money was found in Barbara's purse, but there's a bunch of other money that's missing, and this is going to come into play in this whole mystery and investigation. Stefano Mele would be sent to trial for 2 murders, with the police still not knowing where he had gotten the gun or where the gun had ended up, or really even knowing how he had shot the gun, because it didn't seem like he knew his ass from his elbow when he was holding a firearm. The ballistics report had been completed by Colonel Vincenzo Zuttini, whose name we recognize from other Florence Monster cases, and Zuttini concluded initially that the type of weapon used was a small, long-barreled gun. But even though he compared the bullets to 35 different types of guns, he couldn't exactly specify which type had been used. Zuttini did say that he believed the gun that was used was old and worn, and he believed this due to a swelling at the bottom of the shell casings. Now, apparently, when a gun is worn out, the components inside of the gun are the ones that are wearing out, and this leaves space for air to build up because everything's not flush as it would be when it's new, and this causes swelling to the bullet when it's shot because all this extra air is behind it. Now, this ended up being an incorrect assessment, as we would find out not long ago, actually, I think just 5 or 6 years ago, when someone named General Romano Schiavi, who's apparently the highest ballistics expert in Italy, he illustrated that it was the ammunition used which caused the swelling. Schiavo explained that there's 2 different types of .22 caliber long rifle bullets that could be used. There's supersonic rounds and subsonic rounds. Subsonic ammo is bare lead bullets. And these bare lead bullets were used in some Florence Monster cases, but the supersonic ammunition will have a thin layer of copper around the bullet, and this gives it a more explosive charge when fired. These bullets would typically be used while hunting or like on a shooting range, something like that. But the bullets used on Barbara Locci and Antonio LaBianca, they were supersonic rounds. They had a thin layer of copper around them. So it's been decided that these bullets were just too much for the gun used, which caused the swelling. Also, the supersonic rounds are much quieter. They don't make as loud of a noise when shot. So Stefano Mele had been presented with multiple types of guns to compare the one that he had been handed the night of the murders, and he had pointed to a Beretta, claiming the one he'd used to kill his wife and her lover was like the Beretta, but the barrel had been longer. So in April of 1969, Stefano Mele's son, Natalino, was interviewed by Dr. Alessandri, who I believe was a child psychologist or at least somebody who was trained to speak to children who had suffered through traumatic experiences. Now, at that time, Natalino's life was basically a whole traumatic experience. He'd been living for 7 months at the Vittorio Veneto Institute for Orphans in Florence, and the doctor noticed that Natalino seemed to have some memory loss, and the doctor wrote this off as being due to the trauma that he had experienced being in the car when his mother was shot to death. But when Natalino spoke to the doctor in April, he added a wrinkle to his story. He claimed that at the scene of his mother's murder, his father, Stefano, was there. He'd watched him ride up on a brown bicycle. But then he also said his uncle, Piero, was there too, and Piero had ridden up on a light blue bicycle. Now, according to Natalino, Uncle Piero was the shooter, and Natalino had seen him fire a gun into the car 5 or 6 times before throwing the gun into a ditch on the side of the road. By this point, no one really believed anything that Natalino had to say because he was young, because he had changed his story multiple times, and police believed that he had been influenced by someone to do so, and also the memory loss that this doctor was talking about based on trauma that Natalino had gone through. So they never really looked into Stefano's brother-in-law, Piero, Natalino's uncle Piero. Remember, Piero was married to Stefano's sister, Antonetta. Piero went to the police station with Stefano when he was interviewed by police. Piero worked overnights as a baker, and he lived in Scandicci. So the police kind of felt like maybe that's who Natalino was talking about, but also at that point they were like, this kid's told us so many stories. Piero lives in Scandicci. He doesn't have a car. How did he get here? What's going on? This probably isn't true. They never really checked out Natalino's story at that time, which I can't really blame them for that by this point. Now, Stefano Mele, after he's arrested for this double murder, after he's blamed Salvatore Vinci, after he's blamed Francesco Vinci, after he's blamed Carmela Cutrona, now he comes back and he says, okay, yes, I'm going back. Francesco Vinci was the one there. He was the one to blame. So at his trial, Stefano is telling the jury and everybody there it's Francesco Vinci. In fact, Stefano said Francesco's responsible for everything. I wasn't even there. But then Stefano was pulled away by his lawyer. He spoke privately with his lawyer for a few minutes, and then he came back and sheepishly admitted that he was there, but he just never pulled the trigger. In March of 1970, Stefano Mele was found guilty of both murders. He was also found guilty of slander against the Vinci brothers and Carmelo Cutrone, as well as illegal possession and carrying of a weapon. That they never found, by the way, but okay. He ended up being sentenced to 16 years and 10 months in prison. He was also ordered to pay restitution to his slandered victims. A few years later, he appealed, and I think he got like 3 years knocked off of his sentence, but overall, he was going to be in prison for about 13 years. Now, let's fast forward to 300 takeout coffees later. Sorry. Let's fast forward to 1982, which actually in the timeline that we've set up in these videos is going back. But you know what I mean? Because remember, the police in Florence are dealing with a serial killer who's been attacking couples and leaving their bloodied and battered bodies for unsuspecting civilians to find. Remember, an anonymous letter was sent telling the police to look into the 1968 double murder in Signa. And so on December 1st, the prosecutor's office in Florence sent a request for the investigation records of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco's death. With the record and the reports also came a bag containing 5 shell casings, and each one bore the same defective firing pin signature as the monster's weapon of choice. Now, this caused a problem for everyone, since the Lastra Assigna case had technically been solved, and wrapped up with a bow, and the man responsible for it had been sitting in jail for over a decade, which is where he was in 1974 when Pasquale and Stefania had been murdered. He was also there when Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi had been murdered in 1981, and Stefano Meli, he'd been released after, but he was living in a halfway house for convicts. This house was for convicts who had no family to take them in. They had no place else to go. So it was run by nuns and a priest. And this place was located outside of Verona. And the police went there and they talked to, the nuns who were running the joint. And the nuns were like, we don't know if Stefano Meli can actually be your guy. Like, we don't know if he's actually the Florence monster because he's not all there in his head, and physically also Stefano was so feeble he could barely walk. I mean, he's pushing 70 by this point, if not over 70. Now, Florence newspaper La Nazione had been covering all the updates in the Monster of Florence cases, and this included the connection to the 1968 Signa murders. Now, the police were obviously confused about this. How could it be possible that Stefano Meli, who was charged with what is now going to be considered the first crimes of the Florence monster, he's charged and he's in prison. How could the monster have continued to operate? Or how did the monster get a hold of Stefano's gun that he used on his wife and her lover in order to continue using it in other cases? And this is going to start this whole theory that there's more than one person involved, that there's a group of people involved who were all responsible or connected to the 1968 Signa murders and who now continued wreaking havoc around Florence. So the police were a little confused, but they knew that the gun, the Beretta, was the key. If they could find out who had that gun, whose possession it was in, who had been using it, then they would solve these crimes, or at least they'd be on the right track to solving these crimes. And the public was super curious. They were super curious about the 1968 murders. This was becoming a whole mystery that had so many different layers and side plots and side quests that everybody was just grabbing their newspaper every morning to see if there was any more news about the Florence monster. So the public wanted to know about Stefano Meli, and one smart reporter was going to get them the story they wanted because journalists had been knocking on the door of the halfway house where Stefano was staying from the moment the papers had printed his name, but the priest who ran that home wouldn't let any of them in. And so, in an act of quick thinking, La Nazione's own Mario Spezzi showed up with a camera crew, and he told the priest that he was there to make a documentary about all the good work that the home was doing for released convicts. And so he was allowed into the home, and he ended up securing the first and only interview with Stefano Meli. So Stefano was at first kind of not really sure about what was happening. He was a little suspicious, but he started warming up to Spezzi and the crew, and he showed them pictures of his late wife. He showed them pictures of his son, Natalino. And then they asked him about the 1968 double murders. And at first, once again, he seemed kind of suspicious about why they're asking. He would give long and rambling answers. He talked in circles. He didn't make much sense. However, before Mario Spezzi and his camera crew left, Stefano did say, quote, "They need to figure out where that pistol is. Otherwise, there will be more murders. They will continue to kill," end quote. So this series of events would lead to a portion of the Monster of Florence investigation, which would become known as the Sardinian Trail, which focused on the Vinci brothers, but specifically Francesco, the youngest Vinci brother, based on his criminal history for theft, his violence towards women, etc., etc. He was the most swaggery of them all. He hung out with criminals. He considered himself to be sort of like a mafia kind of guy. And so they focused on Francesco, especially when they found out that after the 60s, he'd moved around the Florence area a lot. And ironically, the places he ended up being lined up with many of the Florence monster's crimes. Now, Francesco would be arrested in August of 1982, and throughout the rest of the summer and the fall and the following winter, the monster did not strike again. And this solidified in the investigators' minds that they had the right man behind bars this time. But Mario Spezzi, the journalist who'd interviewed Stefano Meli, he was not so sure. During this time period of inactivity on the Florence monster front, so basically the late summer, the fall, and the winter of 1982, Mario Spezzi wrote a book about the elusive killer. And he goes over everything that they know so far, but the last few sentences of his book read, quote, Many investigators feel the case of the monster of Florence is solved. But if, at the end of a dinner passed in pleasant company, you were to ask me what I thought, I would tell you the truth. That it is with a strong sense of unease that I answer the first ringing of the telephone on a Sunday morning, especially if the previous Saturday evening was the night of a new moon." End quote. And Mario Spezzi's phone would ring on the evening of September 10th, 1983, with the news of another double murder. And this time, the murder was of 2 men. Now, law enforcement couldn't be sure at first if these new deaths were the work of the monster, but soon they would be faced with his signature killing style and weapon of choice at the crime scene. And there would be no more doubts that the Florence monster was still at large, and he wasn't going to be stopping anytime soon. And that's where we'll pick up next time. But before we go, let's dig into Stephanie's Small Business Showcase. Woohoo! Today's small business comes from Rob and Nicoletta Holzer of Holzer Handcrafted. And it's Rob who writes me saying that this business began as a woodcrafting journey for himself, and then last year in 2023 they expanded to include candles and soaps that Nicoletta makes. And Nicoletta and Rob both watch my channel, and they also watch Crime Weekly, so shout out to you guys. Love you so much. I clicked on the link for their website, and the first thing I looked at were the wood offerings because I like wood. I've done wood burning in the past. I like wood things, and let me tell you, they've got cutting boards on there. They're so gorgeous. I gasped. Okay, there's even a custom hardwood dough press on there that's gorgeous, but I'm going to be saving my pennies for this gorgeous jewelry box. I've been looking for one. I wanted to make sure it was the right one that fit in with my aesthetic, that could hold my jewelry, which is so unorganized right now. And I've been waiting for the right thing that was going to hold it all, and I think I just found it. It's gorgeous. They also have wood soap dishes and wood coasters that look like you can personalize them, so check that out. Moving on to the other offerings, I love the candles. Right off the bat, I love how they look because, first of all, they've got wood wicks. Nothing is more magical than the crackling sound a wood wick candle makes while you're taking a relaxing bath. Let me tell you, I promise you, you will never find a more relaxing ambiance than that. These candles are crafted with premium coconut soy wax blend and luxury fragrances to add some peace to your space and create a truly immersive and sensory experience. And how cute is it? The first candle I see is named Nicoletta. And listen, it's not actually Nicoletta's candle. These are candles you can personalize yourself. You can put somebody's name on them. You can put a description of them. For instance, Rob has made Nicoletta's candle say, quote, partner in crime, travel buddy, preventer of poor decisions, best friend, loving wife and mother, end quote. Adorable. So you can put anyone's name and description on there, and then you choose the scent, a personalized scent for that specific candle. And I need to know, Rob, what's Nicoletta's scent? Tell me. Tell me now. So they have all different scents that you can put into your candles, or you can buy each candle specifically. So they have the campfire scent, and they have a campfire scent candle, or you can put it on your personalized candle, but the scent of that is woody and smoky. They also have dew on a petal that's going to be fruity, sweet, and clean. They've got enchanted forest, which is spicy and citrusy with notes of leather and sweet brandy, but I think my favorite would be New England autumn harvest. I haven't smelled it yet, but I can promise you nothing is better than a New England autumn, and you know that's a fact. So the top notes on this candle are clementine, peach, apple, and clove, with heart notes of bee pollen, golden honey, and plum, and base notes of vanilla, almond, and applewood. These people clearly know what smells good, clearly. I need that candle immediately. I don't care. I don't care if it's winter, and I don't care if spring's next, and I don't care if fall's like another year away. I need it immediately. So check out Holzer Handcrafted. I've linked their website as well as their Facebook and Instagram. Give Rob and Nicoletta a shout out. Tell them they're doing a great job. Tell them they're adorable. Grab yourself some candles and cutting boards while you're at it. And thank you so much for sharing Stephanie's Small Business Showcase with me. Thank you so much for being here for part 2 of the Monster of Florence series. We're going to pick up again with part 3. But until then, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye. Oh, I forgot to tell you about my lip combo. Okay, so for anyone who's curious about what I wear on my lips, which I pretty much nothing right now because I've been talking and drinking so much in the course of the last 3 hours while I recorded this, but it's really easy. I use Lawless Beauty lip liners. I like them. Or I use the Sephora brand lip liners. I really like those too. They're soft, they glide on nicely. I always like to do a little sugar scrub before I, put anything on, a sugar scrub, and then I put like a little lip mask on while I'm doing the rest of my makeup. That way when I put on the lip liner, the lip mask has softened my lips and made them like super supple and easy to put a liner on and kind of do whatever you want. And then I usually just use my go-to, which is Clinique Black Honey. This is a beautiful lipstick. It's not like a lipstick. It's like a lip. I don't know what it is. It's got color, but it's more like, and it's not a gloss. It's got color. It's kind of like a tinted lip chapstick thing, kind of. It's very moisturizing. The color is very flattering. It's beautiful on everybody. It lasts quite a long while for not being a matte. I don't like anything matte on my lips because they feel dry. And sometimes I'll cover that with a little of the Lawless Beauty Forget the Filler lip gloss on top, or I really like the e.l.f. lip stains. So sometimes I'll throw those on top, and then I'll just throw the Clinique Honey on top of that, Clinique Black Honey on top of that. So pretty easy lip combos. The liner, and then this. I don't really use lipstick. I don't use anything matte. I don't like how they feel. I love a good lip stain, and this is always going to be my favorite. I love Clinique Black Honey. I've used it forever, since high school, and I will never stop. So that is that for you, and now we will truly end the video. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I bury, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's killing you slowly. It's all you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings, blood on the strings.